Welcome to another video in the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Right now, we're working on building out our first section of work, which is the basic cash register. In this video, we're going to be getting the available items for sale from a database through the API and into our WPF project. Now, if you're a Patreon supporter at the $5 per month level or higher, make sure you head over to get the latest source code. Either way, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you can follow along. Finally, as you think of suggestions, please leave them down in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on this course. I've got a running list of suggestions for improvements, and they'll definitely be making this application better. So let's get started. The first thing I forget to do half the time on a video, but I do is I check for any changes that are in my working directory, and there aren't any, but I also go to the sync tab and make sure I do a fetch to see if there's any changes on the remote server. And there's not, because I'm a single person working on a project. So, but that'll definitely make a difference if you're working on a team. Okay, so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to work on the sales register. So if you go to the UI project and look at the views, we look at the sales view, what we're going to do is we're going to populate this items list with some actual data, some available items to purchase. Okay, so in order to do that, we have to go all the way back to our data and look at our database. And we have two tables here. We have the products table. What the products table does is it holds all the different types of products that we sell. So it has the product name, the description, and the retail price. But then we also have this inventory table. And the inventory tells us, yes, you sell those products, but here's the actual products you have in stock. So you have the product ID, how many you have of that product, when it was, what the purchase price for that whole bundle was, and the purchase date. So when we say we want to populate this items area, it's really a little bit more complicated than just saying, okay, we'll put this table's values in here, because it's actually a combination of these two tables. So we'll have to get the product list and then how much of that product we have in stock. Now, this does raise an interesting question. And this is why it's good to sometimes take a step back from your design and look at it and think it through. And we've actually had some discussions in the comments on this particular issue. And that is, okay, so you have a quantity. Let's just say you bought 10 of product one, whatever product one is. So now I come over to my sales view page. I purchase one of them, check out, and all the rest. Do I change this quantity to 9? And if so, how do I remember how much I originally purchased it for versus how much I originally purchased? So the purchase price, let's just say we bought 10 of them and it's $100 the overall purchase. That means it's $10 per item. Well, if my quantity goes down to 1 and the purchase price is still $100, now it looks like I've purchased it for $100 but only bought 1. And that doesn't make sense. And you could say, well, what we can do is we can look at the sales detail page and look at the product ID and the quantity, and then you know how much you have in stock, because you have the original purchase, which we're not going to change, the quantity, and then you have all the purchases against that quantity, and then you can do the calculation and get an end result of here's how many items we have left in stock. And that's possible, and that's probably a good way of going about it until you get to the point where you have hundreds or even thousands of transactions. Think for a minute down the road when we're talking, let's just say 5 years into using the system. In order to find the quantity, it's of how much, product one we have in stock. We're going to have to do calculations on the inventory we've purchased for that product over 5 years. Let's just say there's 100 records for 100 different purchases. So we're going to calculate that. And then we're going to have to go through the sales detail page for 5 years and find all those quantities, add them up, do the math on that, and get the end result. Not really a problem actually for SQL. unless you get into very, very large data sets, which a larger retail company would. Well, then you've got a problem, because at that point, you're just bogging your database down, and every purchase makes it a little bit slower. That's not a great idea. So the other way of going about this is to keep the quantity stable. Don't change that, because that's a point-in-time purchase. Just like this is a point-in-time purchase. But on the actual product, we could add a column called available quantity, or quantity in stock. And then we can change that value. So every time we add to the inventory, we increment the product, the quantity in stock, by however many purchased. And every time we get a sale, we decrement the quantity in stock by however many were purchased. That does mean that this data over here is secondary data, meaning it's not the primary source of truth. It's an approximation. Because what if you forgot to do it once? Or what if you had a glitch and something went wrong? It doesn't tell you the full truth necessarily. It's not what you trust in the end. And that's okay. You can have those columns. And what we can do is we can occasionally run a job that goes through our inventory for a whole 5 years or however long the company's been running, and calculates how many we purchased, and then goes to the entire sales detail page and calculate how many we sold. And that should give us our true number. And we can even update then the product table to have that new value. We could even do that nightly if we wanted to keep that number synchronized just in case we have any differences. Or we could nightly check that number. And if there's a variance of any kind, then we could throw some kind of alert and say, hey, we've got a problem somewhere because this number should be right and it's not. So let's find out where that problem lies. All things we could do. So I think we're going to go that route. It makes this query easier because we don't need the inventory table anymore. We don't need the sales detail table. We just need the product table. And I think that in the long run, it's more efficient. So let's do that. Let's create a new column. Let's call it quantity in stock. Make it an integer. And make it not null, and the default value is 1. And can you move this column up? I don't see a way to drag and drop, but that's okay, because I can do it down here. That's one of the benefits of this way of working, is I can just Control X and cut it out here. And then I can paste it in, let's just say after retail price is probably fine. And I put it in the right spot. So just cut and paste, make sure you get your commas right. So I cut from the comma all the way down to the end. Therefore, I pasted it right before the comma in retail price, so that it put my comma in, and then the last character was 1, and then it left the other comma there. So just make sure you get your commas right. That's a tricky one. So I think that makes our situation a lot better, a lot more efficient. And I really appreciate those of you who jumped in on those comments and talked that through with me and said, I think this is probably a better way of going, because I do think that this is a better option right here. So good job on that. Let's move on to getting this data into the API. So the way I operate is I create a store procedure for everything. I know some people don't like store procedures, but I do. And one of the reasons why is I want to have that final line of defense in my database. I want to secure my database to only have store procedure access. And then I know that it's almost fully protected just with this, from SQL injection and from accidental, modifications to tables, or people getting a hold of credentials and running commands against the database like delete from table with no where clause and all that kind of stuff. Users can't do that with the credentials in their app.config or web.config file. So it is kind of ups the security level. I think it also does some other things for me as well. And we won't get into all of those. But I really like store procedures. So what we're going to do is create a store procedure for this product table. So a new store procedure. And we're going to call this SP product, and it's called lookup. Or get all. How about that? It's a little more clear. So because we're not going to filter this in any way. We're just getting all the products. So you don't need parameters either. So it's a very simple store procedure. So we have the select. We can just select star. We'll come back to that in a minute. From dbo.product. And we'll have an order by. Let's look at the product table real quick. Let's order by the product name. I think it's probably the best idea. Okay, and we can control dot here. We should be able to expand this out. But my control dot in 2019 has not been working. I'm not sure why. So here's what I'm going to do. Because I really do want to have all of these listed out separately. The reason you don't do select star, or you should, I want to say shouldn't, because that's a little harsh. You got to think about it when you do select star. Because if you're depending on things that come in a certain order, then you should really have them specified in that order. If you are expecting only certain data, then that star will bring in other columns if you add them later. And that might be a problem, especially if you add a column later that's of sensitive nature. So for right now, we have just this product, but what if we had an internal value like wholesale price, which you might not want to ever go down to a customer. In that case, we don't want that star because that would send that wholesale price as well. So it's just something to think about, the idea that the star might not be the right solution. Some people say never. I am not that dogmatic because a lot of the ways we work with databases now has changed since we first worked with database. It used to be we'd say column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, and then map those to our data points. Well, that's not the case anymore. We use Dapper. So we say the first name column, or in this case, product name, description, retail price. It doesn't matter if you messed up that order. They would still go in the right columns or in the right method or properties. And in the same way, really, if I returned back, if I had a model that had these columns, they're up here, and then I added a column later and the star picked it up, it would send it, but my model wouldn't pick it up because my model doesn't have that property. So even though we're sending it down the wire, we're not actually capturing it. It's still not ideal because we're sending it across the wire, which means extra bandwidth. And if it is sensitive information, someone could capture that still. So again, still not totally ideal, but it's not the end of the world to use star. So just with that in mind, we will go ahead in this case and specify the columns we want. Product name, description, retail price, quantity in stock. I'm not sure we need create data last modified. So let's leave those alone. This also allows me then to filter down to just the columns I need. Since I don't need these last two, I don't have to waste the bandwidth. Also notice description is blue when the rest are white. And the reason why is because description is a keyword, but with SQL, what you can do is wrap it in those square brackets, and then it's good to go. So some people say don't use the word description. I find it hard not to. And I find it overly verbose to use something else sometimes. So it's not the end of the world to use description, just like name is another one. If it's just name, that's also a problem. So that's why I use product name. But in this case, I could say product description. That's kind of long. So I just use description. And that's really all there is to it. We could set the no count on. Doesn't hurt. What that's doing is just it's not returning the row count when you are returning this data because it's extra information you don't need to send. So that's in SQL Server Management Studio or SSMS. That's the default when you create a new store procedure is to have it on. I usually turn it on just because it's pretty common practice. But at the end of the day, sending that number across isn't the end of the world either. So you don't have to stress out about having it. Okay, so now you have a store procedure that is product get all. Let's bring this back up into this. So we only have one set. We don't have it split. Let's close the others. So now we have just this tab open. Now we can move on to the next step, which is to go to the API. So that's the data manager. And the API, we need to have an endpoint in our controllers for the products. So right now I have 4 controllers. We have the account controller. That's where we do all of our login information. So that's all the information about that, managing all the rest. It's kind of a separate one. It's kind of a little different than most in the fact that it doesn't really look like a normal API that we build. So just know that this one is created by Microsoft. They handle all the stuff with things like how the routes work and all the rest. So we just kind of leave that one alone unless you have to modify something with the account system, of course. But for the most part, this one just doesn't get touched. We have the home controller, and that's the actual controller for displaying that page, the home page with the menu and stuff. We have, let's skip over user for a minute. We have a values controller, which really doesn't do anything. In fact, this is just dummy data. And in fact, we're going to delete this at some point. But this right now is a decent demonstration of what an API endpoint looks like with the different types. So we have our get, which returns everything. We have a get, which is limited by ID. We have a post, a put, and a delete. So that's kind of our demonstration. But then we have our user controller, and this is where we get our user information when we log in. So that's all of our controllers, kind of a review here. But now we need to create a new controller. We could cram all this into one controller, but it doesn't make logical sense for our API. Now, we're not following a strict REST protocol, but which is typical with an API. People say, well, it's a REST API. The reality is nothing is truly REST, okay? It's more RESTful. But the actual REST standard, I don't know of any API that actually follows it because it's very, very specific and there's some problems with it as well. But the general ideas we mostly follow. So if you want a product, you wouldn't necessarily think to look in the user control or the account controller. And that's true. REST says if you want a product, you'd go /product. And that's what we're going to do. So we're going to create a new controller. We're going to call it, let's start with a empty controller. And I did say API controller, right? Let's cancel that out for real quick, make sure. Because I did not. I said MVC. Oops. So there's MVC controllers and API controllers. I'll show you the difference in just a minute. But these are slightly different. So we're going to say an empty web API 2 controller. And we need to give it a name. Notice it looks the same for right now. And we're going to call this the product controller. And this will scaffold out a new API endpoint for us. And notice it inherits from API controller. Our home controller inherits from controller. So that's the difference, is where it inherits from. So if you accidentally create the wrong one, no worries. Just change controller to be API controller, and then you're good to go. Okay, so what we want to do in here is we want to create something very, very similar to this, where we have a get that gets all of our records. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to do a get. Now, I prefer to return a list. Some people, I get why an IEnumerable, and when you're calling it from the front end, it really doesn't matter because you're really just converting that to JSON anyways. but all of our data from our data access will come as a list. Therefore, we'll just make it a list instead. Now, I don't know what type it is, so we'll have to figure that out. And I don't think we need to get the user ID at this point because we don't really care who they are as long as they're authorized. Let's look back at the values controller again. And there's no authorization tags here, but there is, I believe, in the user controller. Yes, there is. It's right up here. Authorize. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say right at the class level, you must be authorized. So that's authorized, not authorized, no D at the end. But that says that you are then authorized if you hit this controller and actually get data back. So we don't need to capture the user ID because as long as they're authorized, we're going to say, yes, you can get a list of our products. We'll dial in the security levels in a little bit where we'll say, okay, this method only admins can do, and we'll kind of limit that. But for right now, just authorize is fine. All right, so we have this new controller called the product controller, and we have a get call, but we need to return not a list of string, but a list of products. Let's go to our models, and let's create. Well, let's look at how the user controller does it first. So the user controller gets an item right from the database, or right from the data access layer. So it didn't even create a model for it in the front end. And this is one of those things where it depends on how you're working with it. So in this case, I think it makes sense just to get it right from the data access because there's no transformation that we need to do on the data, at least not yet. However, at some point, we may need to add some attributes to our model, things like this is how you display it. This is how you would name it, and those type of things. In which case, we'd want to create a model in our models folder in our API, because that now becomes our display model. But for right now, our display model and our data model are the same. And there's no reason to create two models if they're identical. Therefore, I'm going to use it directly from the data access layer. So we'll leave that one alone and do the same thing we're doing here. We won't worry about making sure that, that we have a separate model in our front end, because then we need to learn how to map it as well. And again, we'll get to something like that in the near future where we'll have to have a display model that we map our data model to. Okay, so let's go to our library and look at our data access and our internals. So we have our SQL data access, and then we have an example here. It's always good to look at what you already have, because then it's a model for how to do it the next time. And you kind of refresh your brain on, okay, this is how we do things. So you do the same way every time. So I'm going to follow this pattern right here. In fact, I'm going to split this off in a minute into a screen side by side. So I can do basically the same thing I'm doing right here. And then I'll be able to follow the same pattern, and it will look the same way and it will work the same way. And people aren't confused when they see my source code from one spot to the other. People say, oh, this is the pattern, therefore this is what I can expect. So we'll also need a model. So let's create a new model. So new class. And the class name is going to be product model. Make it public. Don't forget that. And then we'll just need to create basically the these items here. That's all I really care about. I'm going to copy these. I'm going to paste them in a code comment. And so I'll say prop, and I'll tab, and I'll say ID, and I'll do prop again. And this is a string. Again, a string. This is a type decimal because it's money. And this is a type int because it's a whole number. Make sure you spell them all right. And there we go. Now, personally, what I would do next, and I don't think we did it here either. We did not, because it's time consuming for video. But I would do my / comments on each one of these. So I'd say the unique identifier for a given product, like so, and just keep documenting all of these, because then you can see that in the documentation in our front end, in our documentation. Whenever you're calling this, you'll see it. It just makes it a little easier for the next person coming along that they can read that documentation too. So if you're going to leave stupid comments like this is the ID, this is the product name, don't leave them. They're worthless. But if you describe it a little more, then it will help the next person coming along to understand what that is. Now, a lot of these are very descriptive already. So product name, I'm not sure I need to describe that. Description, probably not necessary to describe it. Retail price, again, quantity in stock. These are all pretty clear. But sometimes you get something where it's just not quite as clear. I think we had one in the user controller. No, we don't. So it just depends. But if you find something like that, keep an eye out for it. Make sure it's very, very clear. And then use that / comment to clearly identify what that stands for. Okay, so let's move on. Now we have our model. Let's copy this so we have it. Let's move on to our data access. And we're going to add a new class. And we'll call this the product data. Following again that same pattern of user data. Now it's product data. And we'll make it public. And now, like I said, we're going to split this off. Let's split it. I think we can do vertical. I think we have enough space here. You can also unpin this and give us a little more room. So now we're going to model what we're doing here over here. So we need a public list of product model, control dot to add the using statement for that. And we're going to call this get products. And now, again, we can just follow this pattern. In fact, we'll just copy and paste this right here. Copy and paste is dangerous, so be very careful. You have to go through then. I just did control dot there to add the using statement for this. But you have to go through here and make sure that you are not including anything that's wrong. For example, user lookup, that'd be one that very easily slipped through your fingers. So let's go ahead and make sure we rename that. And let's call this, instead of user lookup, this is the, well, let's look at, I forgot the name. It's a store procedure. It's called SP product _ get all. So SP product _ get all. Now we don't have a parameter here to pass. So let's just do our Control-Shift-P to see what kind of parameter it is. It's a dynamic. So right now we don't have something to replace that with. So let's look at our load data, see if we have any options, or if we just we'll probably just create a new class. So a new anonymous class like so. And that's probably gonna work, but let's just make sure it's not an overload that takes no parameters, okay? So we'll go to our load data, which F12 takes us right to load data. And we can look through and see we have load data and save data, no overloads. I don't think we need one. I think it's pretty easy just to say new and then curly braces. which that just indicates a new object, a new anonymous object, and it does not have any parameters in it. Therefore, it's just empty, and that's okay. So sp product underscore get all is our command, and we are passing in a product model. I'm sorry, getting back a product model or a list of them, and that's what we output. So that should be all we need to do to load our data. It seems underwhelming, the amount of work we had to do, but we followed that same pattern, and that's helpful to have those patterns. So really, in some ways, the first time you do something, first of all, spend some time doing it and make sure you do it right. And then don't be afraid to change it and go back and make some changes if you have to, kind of like we did with the table there. But then you have that pattern, and it gets easier because you just follow the same pattern. And it may seem simple. It may seem like a little bit repetitious, and that's okay as long as you're not doing the same code. But as long as you follow that same pattern, then it's consistent and you understand that's what you have to do, and it makes it obvious what's going on. So now we have this product data class, and we have our get products. So that's inside of our data access library. Let's go look at, again, follow the pattern here. We'll go look at the user controller and see how it gets that right here. And we're still doing the equals new. And so we want to upgrade at some point very, very soon to having dependency injection. So we don't have to do this. But right now we're not using dependency injection. And it feels a little weird, I guess you could say. But we're going to do it anyways for this one. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing we're doing here, and we'll follow the same pattern, and it will be okay. I'm kind of telling myself that more than anything. It'll be okay. So let's start off with creating that new product data. So product data, and we'll call this data equals new product data. I'm going to do a control dot here to bring in the right usage statement. Okay, so now I can just say data dot get products. And that returns a list, so I can actually just return that list. Now it's saying there's a problem because it's not product model we're returning. That's okay. We'll do our control dot there. Now it is the product data we're returning, and now that API endpoint should work. So this is where I typically like to test this out, but in order to do that, I have to comment out the authorize method. I also need to add some data to our table. So let's do that. Let's go over to our SQL Server Object Explorer and go look for our database. So I believe our database is the TRM data. And we have our products, and we have our inventory. So the only thing is though, I have added a column to that product table. So I need to go to my publish location. I had double click this to publish a new copy or a new update to this table. And now that it's done, I can unpin that. I can go to my product table and say, let's view data. And notice that I have my quantity in stock now. So let's add a few products to our table. So let's start with a product name of Fluffy. I don't know why I hit. There we go. Fluffy bath towels. And the description is large, fluffy bath towel set, 2 towels, and 2 wash cloths. All right, the retail price, let's put it at $29.95. That sounds about right. Let's put the quantity in stock of 20. And the create date and last modified date, they'll take care of themselves. Notice it filled it in for me. That's cool. So now let's add a couple more. I'm going to copy and paste. I've already kind of pre-thought out what I'm going to do for these. just because I don't want to waste your time with typing out or thinking through what should this be, because I have a hard time sometimes coming up with examples. So I spent a little bit of time doing it beforehand so that I wouldn't waste your time. So I'm just going to copy and paste a few in. So we have our 10-inch skillet. Now we have our large toaster oven. And this one is $49.99. And we have 5 of those in stock. And now we have our home repair kit. Very important kit to have. It's got our screwdrivers, hammer, tape measure, pliers, level, the basics. And we have 50 of those in stock. So now we have 4 items. We have our quantity in stock. We have some sample data. I haven't added anything to inventory yet, and that's okay, because even though it's some queries wouldn't work yet, we haven't gotten there anyways. So we don't have to worry about that. This is just sample data to get us going. So now at this point, what we can do, since I commented out authorize, that means anybody can call this /product method and get back the product list. Therefore, we can test it right in the browser. It's really quick to do. And this allows us just to verify that it's working up to this point. So let's wait for it to load. And then we can say /API/product. And we get back a list of our products, our non-stick skillet, our large fluffy bath towels, our home repair kit, and our large toaster oven. There we go. So now we have our product correctly working and coming back at least to the API. Now let's stop all of this. We're going to turn authorize back on because I don't want just anybody to read our product list. And now what we'll do to unpin this is we can move on to the WPF side of things. So let's shrink down these things. We don't need them. And now I can move over to WPF and our WPF library. And we can start looking at connecting to the API. So we have our API helper, which is where we get information from our API, including logged in users. I'm not sure we want to keep going on putting more and more stuff in one class. I think that we'll have to put more classes in place and then just call from or inherit from even, we'll see, from the API helper. So let's look at this really quick. It's been a little bit since we've been in here, and so I want to kind of talk through what this does real quick from a high-level perspective. So this is what creates that HTTP client, which lives for the lifespan of our application. So as long as the application instance is open, so is this HTTP client, which is the right way of going about it, because we don't want to have to keep opening that back up, because that can cause some clogging up of our network traffic and even lock up our HTTP clients. So we want to keep one open and just reuse it. We initialize that client right away, and we set up some base information. We use this for authentication, and we also store then who is logged into our application here. We also have the get logged in user info, which uses that HTTP client. So we can make calls to get the information about the user. And that's all this does. But what I don't see in here, and this is what I'm going to think through, is all these use the internal, it looks like the internal private API client. The problem with that is that then only this class has access to that, and only methods inside it can use it. But I really want to have more than just one API system. I want to be able to access the API from different classes because it kind of breaks up those classes and they do one thing. Right now, what this API helper does is the basics, but it also does some authentication. And this is one of those things where it violates the solid principles, but not egregiously. It's not huge in its violation. It's more like it's probably not the best. We could probably separate that out. And I am not one to go crazy with the solid principles, because you could go crazy and the simple hello world application becomes, 30 different classes and 50 different interfaces and all of this to say hello world, or something, close to it, something small like that. So I don't go crazy with it. And in this case, I think it makes sense to have initializing the client and initializing the user experience with logging in, which is the first thing you have to do. I think those two things make sense together, and it is easier to understand. So I'm not opposed to that, but I'm not going to put my product information in this API helper, which means I need to have access to this API client here. Otherwise, I'll have to put my stuff in here. So let's create well, first of all, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to rename this underscore, which I don't know what, I hit control. Haha. Don't hit control, hit shift. Rename it underscore and then do control dot to rename this everywhere. It's now using the underscore, which follows the same pattern as this I logged in user model. Why am I doing that? Well, because then what I can do is I can create a property. I'm going to do it after constructor. It's up to you where you want to put it, but I'm going to do a constructor here. I'm sorry, a property, public HTTP client, and we're going to call this API client, and I have just a get, and it's going to return API client. And that will be a read-only property that I can get that API client and use it anywhere else as long as I have access to this API helper, which if we look at the view model for the login view, notice we pull in that API client. So we can just grab that and it won't be a problem. Also note down here in the bootstrapper, if we look at where the API client or API helper is declared in our container, it is the iAPI helper, and it's a singleton, which means that if I ask for it again, if I ask for iAPI helper again, it gives me the same instance of API helper, which means that there it is. So this HTTP client will be the same for everybody. We won't use a different one for every instance, which is what you want. So now we can do in this API folder is we can create a new class and we can call it, let's call it product endpoint. It's probably a good description. What it's going to do is it's going to connect to the product endpoint of the API. That's one way of going about it. We could also say product API, which doesn't necessarily make as much sense because it's not a full API just for product. So I think product endpoint is probably the best. We could say product endpoint class or product endpoint something else, but I think that's descriptive enough. I'll make it public. And when I create a constructor for this, just like we have in the login view model, we're going to pull in the iAPI helper. And then we'll have, again, just like in here, we'll have this up here, which is going to store that helper for the lifespan of this instance. So now we'll say the API helper equals API helper. So now we have that instance of API helper. Now what we can do is we can start creating methods that match up with our API. So our API has the get all. So let's just do this. Public, wow, there we go. Public list, let's call it string for now. You don't have a model yet. And we'll call this the get all. Since we're in the product endpoint, get all makes sense. Product endpoint dot get all, it makes sense what we're getting. And this is where we'll make that API call, which is very, very similar to what we're going to do right down here. So we'll make a similar call. Actually, right here is probably a better option where we're doing the get async, and we'll do the return status code and all the rest. So let's grab this. Now, as long as we're using the same API endpoint, and as long as we're logged in, we should already have the authorized and the bearer token already added to our default request headers. Therefore, we shouldn't need to add it again every time. So we'll leave this alone. We won't do this up here because we've done it once. We'll make sure it works, but it should. So now we'll paste this in here, and we'll make sure that we say product, and we'll do our control dot here for our using statements. And it's not underscore API, it's actually the, let's start with underscore API helper dot, and it is API client, which we don't have because it's not on the interface. So let's just call it that, and then let's go to our interface and add that. So the IAPI helper, if we go F12, doesn't have that property. Well, the API helper, let's go to the top here and grab the signature for that, that property. Let's find it here, right there. I almost lost it for some reason. So let's go to our interface, which is actually getting lost here. There's so many things open. There we go. And we'll add that to our interface. And we'll say it's just got a get. And we do have to bring the using statement in. Kind of a bummer, but that's okay. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if you have too many using statements. Unless it's causing a conflict in naming, it's fine. There's a whole lot more important things to worry about. So back over here, now in our product endpoint, which got a lot of stuff open. So we can probably, here's what I do. I just give up and say, you know what? Close everything else out, save what's been changed, and now I'll get back to it if I need to. So underscore API helper, I thought we changed that. We have. So it's saying the await operator, because this is not async. Always read your error messages. So that takes care of that. And now read async, but instead of logged in user model, we need a different user model, which we'll also use up here. So let's go in our library, our models. We're going to add a new model, and we'll call this the product model. And we'll make it public. And we'll come over here to our existing library for the API, and we'll get our product model, and we'll grab these. Now, this is something that I did last time, and people really didn't know what to think about it. A lot of people didn't like it because I'm copying and pasting code, not changing anything, and calling it good. So why don't I just link this same library to both ends, to the WPF side and to the API side? Problem solved, right? I don't have to recreate this model. Here's the thing. First of all, especially with models, you can't think about it in terms of dry all the time. In fact, a lot of times in models, we're not dry, or at least we don't appear to be dry, as in don't repeat yourself. We do repeat ourselves, and that can be okay. Now, I avoid it when I can. So, for example, in the API, I didn't create a view, a model for display, a display model. I just used the model from the data access. I took that model directly and displayed it. But at some point, I'm going to break that apart and actually create a copy of that, because I'll want to put display specific stuff in that model. So I'm going to have things like the display name, or I might have some validation on minimum length and maximum length and all the rest. And that would be just for display and just for display on the API. Now, The API might not have all that validation, but it might. On the other end, on the UI, I might do the same thing with different validation. So these are all different models, even though they look the same or similar. They're not the same thing. Now, as far as linking my libraries together and having one DLL that serves both the API and the front end, there's a lot of dangers with that. And I intentionally separated the two out. One, because I'm treating this like it's two separate things. So remember, the user interface and the user interface library, these are a full different project or a full different project set than the rest of them. Now, I kept it in the same solution because it makes it easy to modify, but they really are totally separate. There's that clear dividing line of the API. What that allows us to do is it allows us to have some safety and security because the WPF project has no ability to talk directly to the database. We have to go through the API for everything. That's a good thing. That ensures that we are safe when it comes to our data access. If we ever decide to change to ASP.NET MVC or to .NET Core MVC or to something entirely different, maybe Xamarin mobile apps, we will only have to change out this UI project and probably not even our library. We just change one project and we're all good. So that's one of the reasons why I don't want to mix those two libraries. And another is I'm not going to bend over backwards to make sure that I don't have repeat models. Think for a minute of back when we did on YouTube, we did a video on just talking to APIs. And I picked a few. One of them was the XKCD comic. Another one was the sunrise sunset. And I did another one that was something else. Anyways, we also deal with talking to the Star Wars API in a weekly challenge. I don't control any of those projects. I don't control XKCD. I don't control Star Wars API. I don't control any of them. They have models that they have created in order to display that API information, in order to send that to the API. I don't have control over those. What I have control over is my end, the C# side. And so I create a model that probably looks identical to their model because it's a clear dividing line of projects. The same happens here. Even though we're in the same solution, there's a clear dividing line where the desktop UI and the desktop UI.library, these are a separate system from the API and back. Okay? So that's why I'm not sharing, and it does not hurt anything, okay, to have these copies because there's just so many reasons. But one of them is I might not want to have all of this information. And so I can just drop off and say, you know what, I don't want a description. I can drop it off, and that's okay, and it doesn't affect my API. It just affects the front end, and that's what we want. Okay? Sorry for a little diatribe, but I really want to make sure I explained that thoroughly because that was a point of confusion last time we did this copy-paste. Okay, so now we have our product model. We can come back over here and say returning that list of product model, which we control dot to add the using statement for. We're also going to read as async the product model, not the other type. And then we have to create our list from that. Now we have to change that from product model actually to a list of product model because we're returning more than one. And we don't need all of this stuff because now we have all we need. So now we should be able to just return result. And that should satisfy everything we need. But we need to return it in a different way because it's actually returning async which means we need to return that task. So we come up here, we say not list of product is task of list of product model. And there we go. So whenever you have an async method, you need to return a task. The only exception you should have, unless there's an extreme case, but typically the only exception you should have is if you're having async in a event method. So you're firing an event that's doing asynchronous stuff, yes, that would return void. Otherwise, everything else at least returns task instead of void, or in this case, task of type, return type. Okay, so there we go. We are reading the information, putting the result in, we're returning that, and now we're returning that list of product model. That should be everything we need to do to get that information. Now let's create an interface for this product endpoint. So control dot extract interface. We'll extract it into a new file. And now we have an interface. And now we can go to our bootstrapper and add this in. So we should be able to say, we can follow the same pattern here of like we're doing here. And say dot instance. And then we can add our instance, which is the iProduct endpoint. And the implementation is the product endpoint, like so. And that should work. And actually that's not instance, it's per request. So per request like that. And there we go. So now we have a per request for iProduct endpoint. And now in our sales view model, what we can do is in our constructor, which let's see if we even have a constructor for our shell view model. I don't see it. Let's make sure we don't. I don't see it. So what we can do is right up at the top is fine. We'll create a constructor and we're going to bring in the iProduct endpoint. And we'll call this the, let's call it product endpoint. That sounds good. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it up here and to the underscore. Then I'll say the underscore product endpoint equals product endpoint to map that over. And because of the magic and wonder of dependency injection on our front end, which I love, that's it. So now when I want to access this, which is right away, then what I'll do is I'm going to just ask for our data. So I can say, let's create a list of, well, actually we have that already. We have a binding list of products. So we can just say products equals new binding list, but it's not a string. We're going to change that in a minute. And we can send a value right from the constructor. Notice that's right here. So we can say product endpoint dot get all. That's going to yell at me because it's the wrong type, because it's actually product model, which control dot to add that model. And we need to change this binding list to actually have the right values. And we should also change it down here as well. And that should be all we need to do there. And now it's saying cannot convert. We have to await this. So let's, instead of trying to do it in line here, what we'll do is we'll do it like this, where we're going to say public async. And remember, we have to do a task. Nope, just task, because it's not actually returning anything. This is a constructor. Now it's telling me that the lacks an await, which is okay because we haven't gotten there yet. So we'll just say var products equals, can't call it products. Let's call it prods. I'll call it product list equals the get all, but we have to await this. And now we shall pass that in. And we do have an await in here, but it's still yelling at me because member names cannot be the same as their enclosing type. The problem here is that a constructor doesn't return anything. There is no void. There is no anything. Because a constructor, that's the whole point of the definition, is that it doesn't have that return type. The problem is that now, how do we make this asynchronous? And the answer is, for now, that C# does not allow this in constructors. And the whole reason why not is because of that fact that constructors are supposed to be quick. They're supposed to be something that you just fire and forget. You don't listen for a response for. It just immediately sends back the instance of an object. Now you have to send back an instance of an object, and we'd have to send back the task, two separate things. And that's not really efficient. And so there is some talk at Microsoft on how they could do this and how they could make it work in an intelligent manner. But for now, what we're going to do, and there's a lot of different ways to work around this. And some of them are hacks, and you don't want to go the hacky route of trying to force it to call an asynchronous thing and just ignoring the returns and all the rest, because then you have some really odd situations happen when you have an exception. So the alternative is to do something like this, where you say public, and let's create it as a public just task. We don't really need to return anything. And it's going to be called load products. How about that? And oh, by the way, it should be asynchronous. There we go. Now you may say, well, that just doesn't seem efficient because now we've got to call the constructor and then call load products. Yes, we do. But that's kind of okay because now we can choose how we want it to perform. We can await this load until it's done. Because what if, let's just say this takes 20 seconds to load. Do you want to show your WPF form that has the sales data? Do you want to show that and have it be an empty form, and then 20 seconds later you want to populate that data? Probably not. Probably you want to have some sort of spinner or, loading, please wait message on the screen or something. This gives you the option to do that. So now we have this load products. We can come over to our where we're calling this. So once we load this information up, we want to trigger this. So now where do I call this method? Because we're in the view model and we don't really have a code behind. This is the code behind, essentially, for our view. Well, that's where we can get into doing something like this, where we say, let's do protected override. And then let's look for, let's go with on view loaded. Notice the message is called when an attached views loaded event fires. So when the actual page is loaded, then we'll fire this. So now what we can do is we can make this async. Now it's still void because this is an event. But now we can say await load products. Now you could do more stuff here if you wanted to, but that's, I think, enough. Now we can make this private because we don't need to call it externally just from this onView load event. Now we could put it right in the onView load, but I kind of like to have it separated out into what it's actually doing. So now that should be all we need to do. We've reloaded this. I'm not sure. This should fire the notify of property change, but we're going to make sure. So we'll check that out. And it should be that now we're set. We've got the, we're loading the binding list after we await the call to get all. Let's just put a breakpoint here. So we make sure that, actually a breakpoint here. So we know we have that list. So once we await that and it comes back, that list, we'll make sure that list has data in it. And then we'll see if it displays in the page and all the rest. In theory, we are pretty close to done. Now what we need to do is we need to modify how the sales view will display these products. Because right now, this items list, it doesn't have any kind of binding for, well, what does it display? What value does it display? So let's come down here and look at our list box, which right now, let's shrink this down a little bit. Right now, we just have a list box. We don't have any kind of thing that says, here's how I display anything. So let's change that. And we'll just put our closing tag here so we have it. And now then inside here, we can start binding up our display element. So data template. Yes, data template. And then inside here, we have a text block. Let's just put a text block. We could do more than this, but I think this is good. And then we can say that the text equals, and we'll do a binding here. And we're going to say that what's the property name that we want to display? Well, that's going to be the product name. So let's just put product name in here. And then we need to close out this text block. That should do it. We're going to find out real quick when we break it. So let's start this up. And I'm going to move on just a WPF form. We're going to log in. And then we're going to display the form. We should go right to our products list. And we see, let's look down here. We have 4 products. Let's just look at the first one. That's that 10-inch skillet. It's a non-stick skillet. So we're good to go. We hit continue, and we get an exception. Items collection must be empty before using items source. Okay, so what does that mean? So this could be a couple of things. And if we view details, let's just make sure we don't see any extra information. There's no inner exception, and that message is the same as we saw before. So there's not really a whole lot of extra stuff. And sometimes this can be difficult when you're working with MVVM, especially in WPF, because it feels like you're working with thick gloves on. You're trying to grasp something it's a little difficult. So let's look at what's going on. So we have, if we mouse over products, so let's just look at this. And we have products right here. And I don't see any errors here. Sometimes an error will show up in this list. I do see height of not a number, but I don't see anything else. There's an items list. I don't see anything else that's really indicative of a problem yet. So that's probably not what it is, but let's keep going. If we look at the products in the view model, then we'll see that, which that should be right here, products. We have 4 elements, and we have our non-stick skillet, a 10-inch skillet. The ID is 2, the quantity is 10, the retail price. So it looks like we have all 4 of them. So it looks like that is actually fully loaded. So now the question is, why is this error being thrown that says items collection must be empty before using items source? So let's stop this and look at the sales view. It probably has something to do with this right here, with how we're doing the binding. So just to try something, because again, there's a couple different reasons for this issue. I'm going to Control X to cut that name out. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the item's source equals and do the binding this way. And we'll say the binding is the, I just lost it here. It's the, should be products, like so. And let's just see if that binding works. And let's take that breakpoint off. Let's see that binding works because there's item and item source, items source. So it may be that the name was doing item and this is trying to pull from item source and that's causing a problem. We'll find out in just a minute. We load this up. So Tim at I am Tim Corey. And we're still getting that exception. Okay, so let's do this. Let's stop this and just comment this out and come back here and put this back the way it was. So the only thing now we've changed is we're still making that call, but we're not assigning it to any data. So we're not loading that data into our list. We're just getting the data. That's it. And then over here, we've got this binding and we're binding to the product name. Let's just make sure that that part works when nothing else is loaded. So this is how debugging works. You try different things, but try one at a time if you can help it. Don't have multiple changes at once. Cannot find view for system.window.data template dot. Let's see, make this bigger. We cannot. Okay, so there's our problem. We can't find a view for, so there's a linking problem here. So let's stop this. And let's look at our login view. We did the same thing over here, I believe. Oh, we did not. We only have drop downs. We don't have, text boxes. We don't have drop downs. All right. This is one of those things where it was a stupid little thing, and I did some research. So I paused the video for a minute because you don't want to see you do research. But yeah, XAML is tough because it's not necessarily intuitive. And when you miss something, you really miss something. In this case, I have a data template here, but I never said that it's an item template, which, why do I have to say it's an item template? I'm not entirely positive, but I'm sure it makes sense. So you have to say list box dot item template, and then inside here, paste that data template. That is how you define, okay, so for the items, this is how you're going to display them. And then you can use the, in this case, just one text box that just, or text block that says this is the product name. Now, I can do a stack panel in here and have multiple text blocks, or I can create even a grid and do something more complex, but this is good enough for now. Now, since that is in place, we should be able to go back then to our view model, which is the right here, and we should be able to uncomment this line right here, which loads the products, and it should be, in theory, that when we start this and run this, that our application actually loads data into the right place. Let's see if that works. And there you go. So now we have 4 different items in our items list. It's the full object, not just the name. It's actually the whole object behind the scenes, but we just see the title or the product name. So with that, I think we're going to stop there. This is quite enough video for now. I've gone a couple different rants on how to do these different things, but the key lesson to be learned from this little piece at the end is that when you have these weird problems in XAML, one of the things you can do is go back and look at an example. because I have other examples from when I did XAML on YouTube that I can look back at and go, oh, that's how I do that. And honestly, that's one of the reasons why I started getting into writing articles and doing videos. Is as much as I love you guys and as much as I want to help you guys out, I was helping myself out too, because I forget things. And especially if I don't use something for a couple of weeks or a month, I'll forget the little details that are so important to programming. So writing it down, documenting it really helps. And also having those patterns, because now that I have this pattern in place, guess what? I can do this again and again and again because I have it done once. So doing it the first time is kind of hard, but after that, it gets easier as you follow those same patterns. That's also a good reason why you do these sample projects, because if you do a sample project beforehand, you have that pattern down and you've tried out the different things that didn't work. And then you got the thing that did work. So now you have the right way of doing it and you don't have all this extra code sitting out there from the things you tried that didn't work when you go to build your actual application. So just a couple of notes there. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next video, we're going to wire up this page itself. So we're going to look at getting the selected item. We're going to have a property for that. And then we're going to say, okay, how much, what's the quantity for fluffy bath towels for quantity on hand? And then we're only going to allow the user to put in that number up to whatever that number is. If they say 58, there's only 50 on hand, it's going to say, no, you can't do that. It's too high. And we're going to allow them to add to cart. And we'll see how far we get with this. May take 2 videos. I don't want to do 2 hours of video for one video. But with this, we'll be able to move on and start seeing some real progress in getting a working sales page. All right, so that's what's coming up next. In the future, we're also going to do that dependency injection on the API side. I'm really want to get that in place, but I want to get ahead a little bit in these other areas so you have something actually working before we go back and put in dependency injection. Okay, thanks for watching. As always, I am Tim Corey.